Introducing National Streaming Sports, live and on-demand sports talk programming that you can access 24/7. For the premier sports talk experience, tap into our Roku. If you like the sweet science, get ready to talk boxing on the Gloved Fist podcast with top boxing writers Frank Latirzo and Jack Hirsch. Frank, a former amateur boxer out of Philadelphia, writes for NY Fights and can be seen on the Boxing Channel. Jack, an amateur boxer who competed in the New York Golden Gloves, was a 6-term president of the Boxing Writers Association. And now, here's Frank Latirzo and Jack Hirsch.
And we're back. Welcome to Glove Fist. My name is Frank Latirzo, former writer, full-time observer, joined by 6-term Boxing Writers Association President Jack Hirsch. Jack, I understand there's something you need to say.
Yeah, there's. I hate to start the show on a somber note, but yesterday, one of the personalities in New York boxing, a friend of mine, someone I've known since I've been 15 years old, in fact, he was a boxer at the Sweeney Center Police Athletic League in Brooklyn during the time I was there, and Vito Antifermo was there, amongst others. And Eddie Post, he was known as Eddie Espasti then, Eddie Post. He was close to 80 years old. He passed away, Eddie, yesterday. You might know him better. His legacy in boxing, Frank, was as the owner of Spartan Sporting Goods. Spartan.
Well, I know of that. I know of them.
He dressed many a fighter, okay, from George Foreman, et cetera, a whole list of champions. He dressed them. His company wasn't as big as the Everlast company. You know, it was like a small market team compared to Everlast, a big market team. But Eddie did things through relationships. He was so close with so many of the elite fighters, even the ones that weren't elite. You know, he had a heart of gold and everything. He had throat cancer around 20 years ago in advanced stage. He survived that, actually, but there were a lot of complications for the couple of decades after. But he went on, you know, he had all these issues, but he kept just rolling along. He was involved in boxing, you know, in various capacities. Well, what can I say? You know, really good guy, excellent guy. Everyone liked Eddie, and he's definitely worth a mention. And his legacy lives on when you see just the Spartan, you know, name, you know, on robes and
right.
The fighters, you know, who've worn them, and that'll live on in eternity, you know, in the tapes of their fights.
Well, may he rest in peace. And Jack, in all honesty, I know about how old you are, and I'm not far behind. You know, 80's not a bad run. We always want more time, but 80's not bad. When I know people that, you know, my mom left at 62, so 80's a pretty good run.
Yeah, that's not the thing. Eddie was a good guy. In fact, the one year I was president of the New York State Boxing Hall of Fame, he happened to be inducted last year. So I remember last August, you know, he came over, we had lunch together, you know, so on. You know, a good guy, but Eddie Post, and he didn't just latch on to famous champions like George Foreman. George Foreman
Right.
didn't endorse things so easily. And then I see George Foreman putting on the gas, Sporting Goods, you know, Brooklyn. You know, and he was especially close, Eddie, believe it or not, with Mitch Blood Green. I'd say, you know, I want to keep away from Mitch Blood Green, but Eddie was close with him, you know, and said, no, Mitch is fine, no problems, you know, anything. But yeah, but I just wanted to give Eddie his due. I guess, Frank, the big news in boxing, you know, things seem to be a little slow, and correct me if I'm missing anything. I guess the thing that dominated the week was Canelo and Crawford. This was the lead-in. This was the start.
Did you see the picture of him and the two of them and Turkey having dinner together and sitting there very, very mild-mannered, and everything seemed nice, and everybody thought, wow, how are these guys going to fight? Then they go on the press tour, and somebody wrote something about it being a little bit of wrestling with Crawford getting in Canelo's face, and then Canelo pushed him. And I know they have 2 more stops on the tour. Jack, I think it's going to be a big fight. The closer it gets, it's more intriguing. Boxing needs it, Jack, because there's nothing big going on right now. We're still a month out from Usyk. By the way, Brian Norman fought last week. I don't know if we got a chance to touch on him, but I'll tell you what, Jack, I got a good look at Brian Norman, and you know what? Brian Norman can fight. He has very good fundamentals and basics. He can punch, and I would be willing to bet right now he may be the guy to beat at 147.
Well, he might be because, Boots Ennis is moving up. He announced that, okay?
Right.
Right. Boots Ennis is moving up. He's not a welterweight anymore, so we're not going to see a Norman Boots fight. So let's not even discuss Boots when we talk about the welterweight division.
He's out of it, right?
Now, he's out of it. Now, we had one of our guests in the past, Patty Donovan from Ireland, okay? And Patty Donovan, excuse me with that call coming in. People, I don't know why they call 7 to 8. Don't they listen to this show? But Patty Donovan was a guest on our show. He's fighting in September. I got this off the presses. A rematch with Louis Crocker, who he lost to on a disqualification after dominating him. He hit him after the bell. It was like a Bo Galata replay where Bo won the fight, but everyone saw Galata beat him up. They're having a rematch, and it's going to be for the vacant IBF title in September. So Patty Donovan probably wins that fight in September, considering how he dominated.
So he gets a piece of the title.
Him and Norman is the fight to make, and that, I'm telling you, it's a tremendous matchup. Tremendous matchup, and I don't want to hear Norman saying, "Oh, Boots is moving up." I booted him.
No, Boots has been making the weight for how many years? He can't make it anymore.
He's talking big, Brian Norman, now that Boots is moving up. But when he had a chance to make the fight, where Boots would have squeezed in one more fight in the welterweight division, Brian Norman didn't step up at that point. So I don't want to hear him talk so bold about Boots being, scared of him, this and that. I just don't go for it.
Jack, I don't either, but at the end of the day, these guys got to say something to keep it going. I mean, they have to look at Crawford and Canelo. Look what they're doing to drum up interest. And I've seen, Jack, I've seen numbers for the fight, and I think you've seen them too. But I've seen Canelo is going to get $150 million, and Crawford is going to get 50. Did you see that?
I did. Let me tell you the mindset of both. Unless Canelo was blown away with money, he didn't want to know from Terence Crawford. Canelo would continue to pick his spots, like he'd fight the Edgar Berlangas, the John Ryders, the Jaime Munguias, the Jamel Charlos.
Right.
He'd keep fighting those type of opponents, guys who, for the most part, are decent, but who he knows he's going to probably beat. He'd be absolutely certain he would beat those guys. Terence Crawford, Canelo knows, represents a tremendous threat. Before they even talked about Canelo and Crawford fighting, Canelo posted something about Crawford. Wow, this guy's phenomenal. This. You know what I'm thinking, Frank? We a lot of times talk, you and I, about a fighter's mindset, how confident he is. Who's more nervous about losing? We're not talking about who's more confident about winning.
Canelo. Obviously, Canelo.
Is more exactly. I think Crawford honestly believes he's about to pick up the belt. So all I have to do is I got the check in my hand. I'm on the way to the bank unless I get mugged, meaning the judges.
Canelo has already come out and said. Canelo has already stated, but then again, I take what fighters say with a grain of salt. He already said that Crawford is the best fighter he will have faced, and he's better than Mayweather. Now, look, I think he's better than Mayweather, but I don't know if Canelo believes that.
Listen, Canelo, let's give him his due. He fought not only Mayweather, he fought Gennady Golovkin.
3 times.
Maybe Crawford is better than both of them. Maybe. Maybe not. I mean, it's a bold statement. Crawford has to prove it, the legacy. If he loses legitimately to Canelo, you can't rate him, on a par. You have to rate him below Mayweather if he loses clearly
Yes,
to Canelo. I mean, if he loses legitimately, I mean, if he gets
I agree.
robbed, I don't. Yeah, and Golovkin
Wow, Jack, I'm
clearly
looking for a
doesn't
fight, and I
fight.
can't argue that. But you're right. If he loses legitimately, you can never rate him over Mayweather. No.
And I don't think the
You know,
size difference now. I was thinking of you earlier today, Frank. The way you make a big deal about the divisions, always hopping 2 divisions. Everyone used to hop 2 divisions, in reality, welterweight to middleweight.
but Jack, we know that Canelo's been a weight bully for a while, and he might be 200 pounds in the ring that night. Crawford might be 170, but Canelo's clearly the bigger bone guy, and he's definitely going to be 20 pounds heavier. But I don't know if that makes a difference. I really don't.
Well, let me ask you this. If we had the traditional 8 weight divisions, things were the way they used to be. Do you agree with me? Crawford would be a welterweight. He fight as a
Yes.
welterweight. Do you agree with me this? Canelo would fight as a middleweight. He wouldn't be fighting as a light heavyweight. There'd be no super middleweight division. He'd be making weight and be fighting as a middleweight. So do we have another scenario of Robinson Lamada here?
Jack, I am tempted to agree with that. The only thing I will say is I'm not sure getting down to 160 what that would take out of Canelo, but I'm sure he could make the weight. I just don't know what he would be at that weight because it's been a while since he's been down there. And we know even when he was there, he was fighting it. Jack, I got to get something off my chest. I made a post today because it's 56 years today that George Foreman turned pro. Okay. And we look back, those 56 years flew by. But our friend Ben Dowdy took something I said and he made a post on it.
Huh.
And I've been going back and forth on it. And it really confounds me sometimes when there are these guys that are cookbook analysis. And when I say that, I mean, if I call you a cookbook analysis, that means to me that it's like your observations are like reading a cookbook. Well, you heat the oven to 300 for 10 minutes. Then you put it to 350 and so forth. And everything falls into place. And if you do that, the cake comes out fine. That's not the case in boxing. So anyhow, I am a firm believer. There's no doubt in my mind that young George Foreman would defeat old George Foreman. But there is a thought out there that older George Foreman, who they say was a better boxer and more measured, would have defeated young Foreman. Before you answer, let me just say this. Jack, yes, old Foreman had better stamina, but he didn't punch as much. Old Foreman he came in, he wore you down, you hit him, you couldn't hurt him, and then he would come at you. But really, all he had, even though he knocked Michael Moore out with a jab and Cooney with a nice combination, he knocked Moore out with a right hand. He basically only had a jab. So you're going to tell me that old Foreman is going to meet young Foreman. Neither one of them ever backed up, but yet young Foreman is faster, meaner, hits harder, and would get there first. If there was ever a fight that was suicide for old George Foreman, it's young George Foreman. And if there was ever a fight that young George Foreman would love, it would be fighting old George Foreman. To me, if anyone thinks that old Foreman could beat young Foreman, I really question how they process things.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Frank, as far as, a younger version is going to beat an older version. We could discuss Muhammad Ali in that regard, too. But the thing about it is, the young George Foreman was a better fighter. Listen, look at the evidence of the second coming of George Foreman. He barely beat Alex Stewart. He barely beat Lou Savarese. He lost to Tommy Morrison. He was losing every second of the fight against Moore until he knocked him out in the 10th round. You mean to tell me the first coming of George Foreman, Lou Savarese, and Alex Stewart would have held him close, nip and tuck the whole fight? You mean to tell me Tommy the Duke Morrison would have survived a young George Foreman? But with that said, if they had a head-to-head matchup, Young George Foreman was devastating against shorter guys like Smoking Joe Frazier, but a tall version of Big George who took a terrific punch, cross arm defense. Maybe, just maybe, he outlasts him, takes a beating, and stops him. I
They
don't
stop
think
it,
so.
Jack. It doesn't go that far.
I
You
don't
give
think
George
so.
that big target.
Listen,
Let me ask you this.
yeah, yeah.
Let me ask you this. Can you name one fighter at any weight in the history of boxing who hit harder and was stronger and better at 41 than they were at 27? In fact, I forget boxing.
No,
Just
no,
pick
no
any athlete in
is
history.
better. No, no one is
Exactly.
better. Occasionally, an athlete puts it together and they go on a bit of a run when they're in their 30s. You know, I could see that 33, 34. All of a sudden, you have a surge and you're getting better. But but then again, I can argue with you. Look at Alexander Usyk. What is he, 40 now? You know, a couple of years ago, look what he did as he was approaching 40. You could,
I mean,
Big
that's a good
Anthony,
example. He's evolved into a bigger fighter.
yeah, I mean, but did he?
But
Was
do you
he
think his
better?
skills are better, Jack? I don't. I just think he's fighting a lower grade of fighter at heavyweight. The same thing with James Toney. He beat cruiserweights and heavyweights more conclusively than he beat middleweights who were closely skilled as him.
No, no. Listen, I agree with. No, I agree with you completely. But the question, the older George Foreman, Angelo Dundee said he was being very diplomatic. He said he's a better technical fighter than the first coming of George Foreman. Yeah, I mean,
I don't even know if I agree with that, but
well, he conserved energy a little better, I think, than the first.
he did that, Jack. But he had to because he couldn't be all out offensive like he was before. Because he was too big and slow. He had to wear guys down by letting them punch himself out against him. The young George Foreman just executed you. And the old Foreman never faced anybody that could hit him as hard as young Foreman. Young Foreman, the only thing he's got to hold off old Foreman, the only thing he has to hold off young Foreman with is a jab. And that's not going to be enough to hold off George Foreman of 73, 74.
The second, we could have a lot of fun with this. The second coming of George Foreman, you call him the old George Foreman. I like to be polite and say,
okay, call him the second coming. I like that.
The second coming was in the ring against Ali and Zaire. Ali wouldn't have to rope it though. We never.
No, Ali would have toyed with him.
Ali would have jabbed him out, boxed him, moved side. Once in a while, he would have fell back on the ropes for rest.
Oh, he would have had a picnic.
Yeah, Ali would have picked that.
Jack, I have one that I think might even be better than that. What if the Foreman who fought Jerry Cooney and Evander Holyfield, because that was the best vintage of Foreman on his comeback, what if that Foreman fought the Lyle that he fought in 76? Who wins that?
Well, I thought you were going to take me in another direction. What happened to you fought the Joe Frazier, March 8th, 1971? That Joe Frazier beats the old George Foreman. Okay, that's
probably
the first coming of George Foreman. But that old George wouldn't have been able.
But what about Lyle, who fought Foreman in 76?
You see, you think I hate Ron Lyle because of our Ken Norton arguments. I was taking a peek at Lyle's record. Who did Lyle knock out who was actually really top of the line?
Only Ernie Shavers.
Don't tell me about Ernie Shavers. Wasn't yet in his prime, and Ernie Shavers ran out of gas and fell flat on his face. You know the way Shavers got knocked out by Ron Stander the same way, by Tex Cobb.
But I'm saying that's the best name he ever knocked out.
Right. But I think Lyle was a very hard puncher, no question about it. I just put him that level below George Foreman as a puncher. I don't put him.
I do too.
Yeah, if he fought that Ron Lyle, I think the old George Foreman defeats Ron Lyle, but it may have gone the distance.
I think the young Ron Lyle probably wins.
I don't think the old George Foreman would have gotten caught up in that shootout with Ron Lyle. Maybe he couldn't have. And I think the
But
old
I think
George Foreman was strong enough, powerful enough. He could have absorbed the blows that Lyle would get in now and then. And maybe Lyle wins a decision for all we know. I don't know. I think it's
I
close
think
enough.
Lyle would win, but I mean, it's not a gimme. But do you think the best Shavers beats the best Lyle? I mean, that was 75. When was Shavers at his best?
The Shavers, around the time he was KO'd Norton and Ali, he hit a certain peak. The Shavers of the Ali fight, I think, stops Lyle. Of the Ali.
Really?
Yeah. And the Shavers.
Okay, I think he gets knocked out too. I think Lyle's a better boxer with a better chin and almost as powerful.
And listen, even though I disagree with you on Lyle Norton, I think the Shavers who KO'd Norton, fought Ali, I mean, would have got Norton, would have stopped Norton. He was that type of puncher. So the Norton that fought Ali at Yankee Stadium in a rubber match gets knocked out early by Shavers, I think.
Bill T, do you guys think Mike Tyson will be back in the ring ever again, or do you think he is done? Bill, I think someone in the next year or so is going to offer Mike Tyson a lot of money and he'll do some type of exhibition.
Yeah, we're having a guest in a couple of minutes is set to come on, but Sean Nam talk about his book and the Everett Escalera fight that you were at, Frank. So you certainly have some strong opinions on that. Very quickly this weekend, Frank, what's the matter with us? Jake Paul fights Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. What a joke.
Is that this weekend? I didn't even realize that. That's how much I paid attention.
I am not getting the fight. I am not getting it.
What is it airing on?
I think it's pay-per-view.
Yeah, I'm not getting that.
I might tune in. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. is a joke, complete lack of dedication. He had some promise early in his career. And when he nearly stopped Sergio Martinez in a dramatic 12th round. He beat John Dudley.
He lost every round before that, but yes.
Right. He fought Canelo. He went the distance. He had some potential early in his career to be a really good fighter. He was under the training of Freddie Roach, but he was lazy. Lazy guy, for fighter. It wasn't for him, but he
wasn't in his heart, Jack.
No, he piggybacked off the famous Chavez name, So, yeah, well, it's what it is there. But,
I'm not buying that, Jack, and I know I'm a degenerate and I buy a lot of them. I am not buying that.
Well, will Mike Tyson never be in the ring again? You know what could sell in this distorted society? Imagine Tyson Holyfield again, a pay-per-view.
I knew you were going to say that, Jack. Holyfield's not getting in the ring with anybody.
Oh, there he is. There he is. You want me to do I'll do a slide intro, Frank. Okay?
I've never met Sean or talked to him, so go ahead, Jack.
Right. Sean, this is Frank Laterzo, my co-host, his co-host, doesn't matter which order it goes in. But Sean Nam authored a book, Murder on Federal Street, about famous junior lightweight boxer in the 1970s, Tyrone Everett, who was, phenomenal boxer, how he got murdered. And Tyrone Everett, had a lot of good wins, but his legacy fight was one of the great robberies in boxing history when he challenged Alfredo Escalera for the world junior lightweight title. At the end of 15 rounds, there was no doubt that Everett had won the fight. And they somehow gave it to Escalera. Now, Sean, I got to tell you, Frank is more qualified to talk about it than I did, even though I saw a replay. I didn't see it live. He was there at the Spectrum that night to see the fight. Started off, Sean, tell us a little about Tyrone Everett in the book, and then we could discuss the fight.
Well, Sean, before you do that, you write for Hannibal Boxing, right?
I used to once upon a time, and Frank, I know you wrote for them too at some point. So,
okay.
Thanks for, quickly. Thanks for having me, Jack. You're one of my favorite mentions in Brooklyn, at least. But you need to get a new. Jack. You need a new. You need a new microphone. I can barely hear you.
Who, me?
Yeah.
Well, you don't.
How do you do that? I try to do it where I can't hear him, Sean. How do you do that?
I don't know. You got to go buy a new external microphone or something. Frank, I hear you. Frank, you're almost too loud.
Okay,
I can barely hear
I'll
you.
get it done. Okay, something.
My voice carries, Sean.
I'll look into. How do I
Talk
sound now?
louder.
How do I sound now, Sean?
Yeah, a little better. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to keep the voice a little louder.
It's all good. Well, I mean, now I'm interested, Frank. Since you were there, it's funny because I think you and Randy Gordon were also there, and
Right. I didn't know him at the time, but yes.
Yeah, I wish I knew. I wish I knew that before, because it was hard to find people who were actually there. But
I was a senior in high school.
Were you from Philly?
No, did you ever hear of a town called Cherry Hill?
Oh yeah. So you're right.
New Jersey.
Ali lived there.
Right outside of Cherry Hill, yeah, of Philadelphia, yes.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, Jack. I mean, Jack, you mentioned the big scandal, 1976 November.
Yep, 30th.
Fight in Philadelphia. I believe the attendance for that fight is still a record in the state of Pennsylvania, some 16,000 odd, which is kind of crazy. You would think that would have been surpassed by now, but it also speaks to the popularity of a fighter that nowadays, in more recent years, is an obscure figure, and he's not brought up. He's not mentioned when we talk about kind of the golden age of Philadelphia boxing in the 1970s, a movement really installed by Russell Peltz, I think, deserves maybe the lion's share of the credit. You needed someone who was going to put in the work and risk a little money, and you had a really ambitious journalism student in Peltz who decided he was going to do this full time. And so, my book is, I just passed the 2-year anniversary of the book. But one of the things that kind of people have mentioned to me in a positive way is the way in which it gets at that era and tries to conjure up a feeling of what it was like to make fights and what the culture was like, which, we can talk about this later, but, it's diametrically opposed to the way fights are made these days. I mean, you don't have local shows anymore on the same level that you had. You talk about Everett becoming a fighter by fighting on these small shows in Scranton. Scranton was a big hub. You just don't have places like that anymore. In a time, I live in New York City. Even 10 years, even 5 years ago, before the pandemic, Jack, you and I would go to all these shows, at least at the Barclays, a few shows at the Garden, but you could count on this, 6 to 10 shows a year that were high profile fights in New York, and we just don't have that anymore.
Sean,
yeah,
I'm from, obviously, growing up during that time and living so close to the Spectrum and the arena and the places where they held the fights. When I sit back sometimes and when I think about the fighters I either saw train or I saw fight. I mean, I saw Joe Frazier and George Foreman fight live at the Spectrum. I saw Saad Muhammad, Marvin Johnson. I saw Duran train at Frazier's Gym for the Vero Ed fight. I sparred a lot of those guys. Michael Spinks fought at the Spectrum. I mean, it just, that era and that time, I mean, I am just so blessed to be a kid. And that's kind of what got me swept up in it. I mean, Ali in 64 opened my eyes to what boxing was. But think about that. I'm growing up, and then are all these fights. I mean, the Spectrum in 67 is opening up in October, and I get to see Joe Frazier fight Tony Doyle there as like a 9-year-old. So you had to live through it to really understand what was how big it was, and like Philadelphia was the boxing capital for that. I would say from 65 to maybe 75, 78.
Mm.
I mean, I saw Leonard and Hearns. I got to spar with them. I saw Hagler train there.
You know, you talk about fighters needing a home base. Would you say that Philadelphia was a home base for Tyrone Everett? Like, you know, certain other areas are for certain fighters. They're always going to fight there. They're always going to draw.
Absolutely. Yeah. He was a Philly. Yeah. Well, I guess there are a couple ways to answer this. Yes, Philly was his base, but he wasn't a prototypical Philly fighter, which is why he's kind of left out when we talk about this history. Because he wasn't a banger. You know, he was not going to come forward. You know, he was not Benny Briscoe, who was beloved, especially by the kind of the old school fight crowd. You know, he was a mover. He could hit hard, and if you talk to Russell Peltz, he hit harder than maybe he even knew himself. But he was a defensive first fighter. He was a southpaw, which again is not going to earn you fans, you know, by being a left-handed fighter, defensive minded. These are all things that went against him. But Philly is where he made his name, where he played his craft. You know, he was not a outstanding amateur. You know, he barely had an amateur career, 20 fights, something like that. So he was moved really well. He clearly he just excelled in the pro ranks. Clearly athletically gifted. He started late in boxing, but by the time the title fight rolls around in '76, he's made a name for himself, and he's, you know, right kind of behind Benny Briscoe in terms of selling tickets. And you know, he had a loyal base in a particular neighborhood of South Philly, which is where he's from, and the South Philly crowd really supported him. And you know, Russell will talk about, you know, he recalls, you know, being at promoting Everett's fights, and you know, noticing his kind of entourage everywhere, and you know, a lot of them were women. And in the book, I start off with kind of a prologue of the women who were at his funeral. There's some, you know, the reports varied, but you know, there were 1,000, maybe 2,000 people kind of milling around the street outside of the church in South Philly, and all you could hear were the wails coming from the women, young, old, it didn't matter. Another point is Tyrone was very good looking, and he was, you know, he knew that, and he, you know, like a lot of successful athletes at his age, on the come up, you know, the world is being handed to you, and you know, you take what you can get. So you know, by the time of his death, his murder, I believe he left behind either 4 or 5 kids. It might be 4. They were with different women. So you know, he was 20, all of 23, I believe.
24, I think.
24.
Sean, you know what I think hurt him, and I don't mean that. I just want to interject a little bit, and I'm sure Jack has some thoughts. 2 things hurt him legacy-wise. Number one, that was, as you said, the marquee fight. That was his signature fight of his career, and it wasn't on national TV. It was on, I think it was on, it may have been on Prism, which was a local cable station.
Yeah.
Okay. So unless you had Prism, which was a pay cable station at that time and kind of new, I mean, they made their name showing a lot of the Flyers games, but the fact that the nation didn't see how good he was, and just as the word was getting out, a few months later, he was gone. And, you know, we never saw him, because imagine if he, in his next fight, how that would have been built up, saying that this guy beat a tremendous, outstanding champion in Alfredo Escalera, who would go on to have big fights against Alexis Arguello. This guy beat him in the ring, and it's like the best was definitely ahead of him. But the reason why he's kind of forgotten is he died so young, and not many people saw his biggest moment.
I
You make a
absolutely
great
agree.
point. You make a great point, Frank. I didn't see the fight until recently. I couldn't. It
Right.
wasn't shown live. After Sean's book came out, I was curious. I said I better finally see the fight. But once you know the result of a fight, you can't score it fairly. I mean, it was obvious that Everett won the fight. I had him winning 11 rounds to 4, watching on a replay, but it's not the same like watching it live. But I can't imagine for the life of me how anyone, even bending rounds, could have scored it for Escalera, maybe 9 rounds to 6. If a judge came in with that, I could live with that score, but nothing more than that. You know, it was just as much a 13 rounds to 2 fight for Everett as it would have been a 9 rounds to 6. But let me just ask, before we talk about the exact fight, I never asked you this, Sean. I wouldn't peg a guy like you to do a book on Tyrone Everett because you're not from Philadelphia. You don't have the connection or whatever. I don't see the link. How did that come about?
I was going to ask that, Jack. That's a great question.
Well, it's a funny thing. So you're right. I don't have any connection, and I felt weird, and frankly a little awkward writing it at the outset, at least. The idea to write a book was hammered into me by my good friend, and also my mentor, Carlos Acevedo, fellow boxing writer and author. And he wanted, he was pushing me to write a book, and he floated an idea, and one of the ideas was Tyrone Everett. And it, to me, so I had all, you're telling me I don't really have organic roots there. I'm not a Philly. I'm not from Philly. I write about boxing, but I'm not from Philly. I wasn't around in that era. But what is for a writer, what do you want? You want to write about something that people haven't touched. We don't need another. I mean, I'm not going to say this. Maybe we do need another Ali book. Maybe not at the same rate. But the library for Ali is full. There are a lot of Tyson.
We don't need a Tyson book either.
Yeah, no offense to Mark Kriegel. I just read his Tyson bio, but it's like there was nothing on this guy. What happened? He died. Did anybody figure out what really happened? He was shot by his girlfriend 6 months after a really suspicious title fight that didn't go his way. And when I looked at it, I'm like, well, okay, there's a way to retell this that should be interesting, but also there's really been no follow-up. There's been no, and as I was researching in the preliminary stages, this is where it started to get really interesting. Is when I was able to kind of tug at the thread a little bit and get a few answers that I didn't come across in the kind of literature, however scant it is, on Tyrone and this saga. In the subtitle of my book, it's Tyrone Everett, The Black Mafia, Fixed Fights, yada yada, Last Golden Age of Philadelphia Boxing. And the Black Mafia piece really kind of brought this together for me, made the whole thing cohere. Because now I had something where, okay, not only can I retell this, but I'm going to bring something new to this story that you might remember if you were around that time. And if you didn't, well, hey, here's a boxing story that, I hope, maybe plays out like a little bit like a mystery. So that's where things got really interesting for me from the writing standpoint. and where I felt, okay, now I feel a connection. I may not be from Philly, but I'm going to do my homework. I'm going to talk to everybody that I know who had kind of a role in Tyrone's camp, and you know, make sure that I leave no stone unturned in that regard. But as a writer now, I have something where I'm you know, I kind of have a white whale before me, and I can chase after.
Sean, for people that are watching and or listening and don't, and the term Black Mafia is totally new to them.
Yeah.
Capsule that for us and how that plays into the story.
Yeah. So the Black Mafia was a vicious kind of criminal group. Started out, I believe, like in the prisons in late 60s, and started making their mark in Philadelphia in the 1970s. And they have a deep connection with the one of the top temples of the Nation of Islam at the time. Nation of Islam, of course, had two of the most high-profile cultural figures of the period, in Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. And this was a sect. It was a very small group, and yet, you know, they had two members of the zeitgeist. And there were members who were eventually there were guys, street toughs and hardline Nation of Islam members who kind of converged at some point, and you have this group that really picked up with the drug trade that was picking up in Philadelphia at the time. And you know, they really distinguished themselves in that they were organized. You know, there was kind of this notion that Black criminals couldn't organize themselves in the way that maybe the Scarfos could, or the Italian mobs could. And at the time, there was reporting that this wasn't the case, and that there was this group in Philly that was quite industrious and organized. And
did they have their hands in boxing? That you found?
I don't know if they had it. You know, there's some members who would eventually, you know, for example, a Black Mafia member, one of the top Black Mafia members who ended up doing a lot of time in the 70s, and would later reemerge in Philadelphia politics, is the father-in-law of Mike Tyson. So there's ways that the Black Mafia has, you know, maybe they weren't right, you know, they weren't invested in boxing. They had members who had maybe a hand in it here and there. And certainly,
I want to go ahead to the fight itself. Frank, what was the reaction of the crowd when Escalera got the decision? How did you see the fight? You remember the way you scored it and the crowd's reaction? Because Russell Peltz said when Ed Darian was announcing the scores that he was embarrassing himself. You know how it was that he was convinced that Darian, the ring announcer, was making a mistake.
Just total shock, I guess, is the best way. I mean, look, it's a Philly crowd, and if it's a close fight, the Philly's going to say their guy won. But it just, you know what, I would say blindsided too, Jack, because as you said, that's 11-4, 12-3 fight. Everett totally befuddled Escalera for the fact that, you know, I talk about this a lot when I break down fights, and some guys, a lot of boxers and counterpunchers do not like to fight as the aggressor. And when they meet a guy that makes them come forward, like Everett did to Escalera, they're off their game. They're open to be countered, and that's pretty much what the fight was about. Everett picked his spots, and it was just one of those fights, Jack, where one guy was constantly a step ahead of the other guy and beat him at every turn. And that would be the best way I would describe the fight. And when it was over, there was no doubt in my mind that Philadelphia would have, its next champion after Smoking Joe in Everett. I'm sorry.
Okay, so the aftermath of this fight, okay, so Everett loses, okay, he gets murdered. Was it ever solved conclusively, like what happened to him? There's a lot of speculation in your book. Has ever anything been, proven really?
No. To put it simply, no. There's an official verdict. The girlfriend did time. She was convicted, I believe, on it's either second or third degree. Anyway, the defense believed that they had won. Because the prosecution was trying for first degree. And to get a second or third and then only end up doing 5 years, it's kind of remarkable in a way.
Yeah, when you told me you were writing the book, what I found, kind of fascinating, some people there was at least one person, maybe more, who wouldn't want to talk to you for the book, who maybe could have been helpful with information. And then when the book comes out, you get a call, they're ready to talk. But by that time, game's over, book's out. I mean, there's nothing more to add.
Yeah.
You can't revisit it anymore.
Can you name that person, Sean?
No, I can't.
No, that wouldn't be advisable. You don't.
Yeah, no, I can't.
Okay.
But I got a few, I had a few things like that where, in the process of writing it, there were people who wanted money before they would talk, and then there were people, after the book came out, were maybe more amenable to doing so, but still wanted something attached. But my hope is, the big thing. The girlfriend's name, Tyrone Everett's girlfriend, Carolyn McKendrick, is still alive, and I was able to speak to her, and I mentioned it in the book. We didn't get anywhere, in terms of having a substantial conversation. But she did express a keen interest in doing so. I think she was told, maybe by her family not to. But after the book came out, I did have a cousin or a nephew of hers reach out to me, and he told me, there were maybe a few things that they would change here and there, but and obviously, he didn't tell me much, but he said, yeah, you basically got at the nub of.
Did you speak to his brother, Mike?
I wasn't able to speak to Mike. I spoke to Eddie, and Eddie is kind of the custodian for all things Tyrone. And, I think he told me at the time that Mike was not in the greatest shape to speak. I would have loved to, because Mike had a longer pro career than Eddie did. Eddie basically stopped after a few pro fights. But Frank, I mean, I'm curious. When do you remember after the fight? What was it like being in the crowd after the decision was announced? There was all this talk about maybe a riot gonna go off, and how Ed Darian had to, basically tell the crowd, we'll let you know the result tomorrow, and that was just a farce to keep everyone at bay. I mean, what like.
You mean to keep the crowd? They wanted you to somewhat believe that maybe it wasn't the case, and we'll get back to you tomorrow. But they wanted to clear the spectrum out for the fact that, again, I think when in boxing, there's been a lot of bad decisions. I mean, and there's been a lot of controversial fights. I mean, Ali Norton 3, Leonard Hagler. There are people on both sides that are pretty strong about their guy won. Your Leonard won or Hagler won. But you could search the earth, and there's not a human being alive who saw Everett Escalera that thought Escalera deserved the decision.
Sean, I want to save the last few minutes talking about current boxing to very quickly tell our listeners where they can get the book and then stay on till the end of the show.
The book is available to order on Amazon. It's available at, I believe, on Barnes and Noble. You might have to order it. I know it's in some of the stores in kind of the local Pennsylvania, New Jersey areas. If you're in New York, it's available in independent bookstores. Bookshop.com is a place where you can also get the book.
Sean, real quick.
Yeah.
Just because I want Jack to know what he's in for. How long did it take you to write it?
I would say from start to finish, from doing the research, interviewing people, to writing, completing it, I would say close to 2 years.
Wow, I'm better than I thought. My book on Michael Spinks is ready. I'm looking at publishers now. That's what I'm basically doing. But, boxing books are hard sell. Unless you have a super legendary name, like we mentioned, Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson, you can get big publishers for them, but even if it's an iconic fighter, if it's within the boxing industry itself, it's a hard sell. It really is, unfortunately. I mean, even a book, we're talking about the super fight in a moment, Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford. A book coming out on the winner of that fight, I don't know how it sells. Maybe a book on Floyd Mayweather might actually sell because he's got a bit of a name. Maybe he crosses over to an extent. But a book on Roy Jones isn't going to sell outside of hardcore boxing fans. It's just the way it goes. Sean, what do you make out of this Canelo Terence Crawford fight? Have you made up your mind who's going to win?
I have to go with Canelo, as much as I think Canelo wins. My thing is, I don't think it's going to be as interesting as people think it is. I love Terence Crawford. I think he's the consummate prize fighter. He's everything you want in a fighter. I mean, the guy, he just has this chip on his shoulder. He's gotten he's the best fighter in the sport, like up there.
Absolutely.
And it's still not good enough for him. He just hears the criticism and it just, watch these interviews. He's not satisfied. And he's always talking about the people that won't give him credit. And he's getting plenty at the moment. But yeah, for this fight, again, he's going to be an underdog. I think we saw something in the fight with Madrimov at 154. The first time he moved up to that weight class. And you saw some of the limitations. For the first time, he did not get a guy out of the ring in 10 fights? I mean, he's knocked out everybody at welterweight. And he wasn't doing that at 140 necessarily, or 135. But at welterweight, he was stopping guys. And then, he goes up against Madrimov at 154, and he gets hit more than we've ever seen him get hit. I still think he won, but it was close. Madrimov has since, he lost to Virgil Ortiz. I just think, who's another 154 pounder. Now you're going up to 168. I just think Canelo's too wily. Canelo is not Canelo's a savvy fighter, and he's big. I think he just knows he's gonna know how to win, and I'm pretty down on Canelo, and I have been for a few fights. I think he's kind of mailing it in. I think the Benavidez fight, I think that's a real duck. They're
not going to fight.
They're not going to fight. No, they're not going to fight. And I think that's a fight that poses a real threat to Canelo, and Canelo's just not interested in that kind of battle at this point. And again, this is a fight in which Canelo once again is fighting somebody who has a severe there's a severe advantage on his side for Canelo. You know, the weight thing.
But he moved up against Bivol. Give Canelo credit. He did go up against a bigger guy in that situation.
And
He probably didn't realize how good Bivol was.
Well, that's the thing, though. And you know, before that fight, there was all this talk about going to cruiserweight. Oh, maybe I'll fight Anthony Joshua. None of that talk anymore, because he knows, you know, and he did take out Kovalev, but Kovalev was kind of a shell of himself. I just think, you know, for Crawford and Canelo, they're both thinking fighters. They like to counterpunch. I think Crawford has more dog. There's too much of a weight difference for me to see Crawford actually hurting Canelo. And
But does he have to hurt him to beat him? Floyd Mayweather and Bivol didn't really hurt him. Randy Lara, you could make a case, outboxed him.
Mhm.
Even Golovkin outboxed him the first time and should have got the decision, but he never really hurt him. So we know Canelo can be outboxed. And if Jermell Charlo can go 12 rounds with him and win 3 rounds, maybe just mailing it in, it's going to come down to there's weight classes for a reason, and that will be the deciding factor. Crawford's the better fighter. He has the better arsenal. The difference is I don't think he has to hit hard enough to knock him out. I think he hits hard enough to get his respect and disrupt him. My worriment is what happens when Canelo starts teeing off on his arms and shoulders and gets a couple of good ones on the chin. Now, I disagree a little bit about the Madrimov fight. Jack knows this. I really think the style of Madrimov making Canelo, Crawford, another guy who likes the opponent to come to him, he kind of made Crawford inch out of his comfort zone and fight a little more aggressive than he has to. And I think that had a little bit to do with it, of why he didn't look as spectacular as we're used to him seeing. I can't make a pick, Sean, because Jack knows this. Crawford is my favorite fighter. I don't want to make a case for him and paint him as the winner because I feel I'll jinx him. So I'm interested, though.
Right. A final bell is ringing on this show. You know, when boxing people talking could go on forever. Sean Nam, or the author Murder on Federal Street, the Tyrone Everett story, and overall boxing writer. Thanks for coming on, Sean.
Thanks for coming on, Sean. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.